So today we are going to be talking about commercialization. It's not a technical discussion today. It's all about the business side of things. And like many of the webinars to date, I've asked Jeremy to provide a very sort of educational session, but we're going to be talking about that in the fundamentals, I should say, going back to the fundamentals, but doing that from the context of medical devices. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jim. My business, Triple Innovation.
Just before you get started, would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I was a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers for 5 or 6 years, and then in financial services consulting and government consulting. I then went to AMP, where I was an executive there for best part of 10 years working with small businesses. And it's there that I really realized that there was a massive gap in the SME community. The big business community is very well served by a whole range of strategy consultants and funding experts. But when it came to the small business community, who were seeking to do a lot of the innovation that happens in the economy, they weren't very well skilled either at strategy or in identifying funding options. So I developed this business, Triple Innovation, to do 3 things. One, to support SMEs to get closer to government and universities, because my view has always been that innovation drives the SME community. And if you can connect with universities and government and secure government funding to drive your research and development, build your capability, then you can project yourselves even better onto the world stage. And this applies equally to MedTech as it does to any other sector. The second reason I fastened on the SME communities, because there was a real cry for help. So when you go out to entrepreneurs and really empathise with who they are and where they're at, there's inevitably an outpouring of quite strong emotions, because the entrepreneurs in this community spend 24/7. They actually invest a large part of their life in trying to make their businesses work, and they weren't being well served by the type of consulting that has been and still is available to them. And the third,
so Jeremy, it's really interesting you mentioned that, because you talk about emotions. I've seen a lot of the reason I think that some of these startups fail is simply they burn out, and they go through this very, very stressful time, and setting aside the business skill they need, they also need sort of almost like this emotional resilience to cope with the ups and downs. It's an area that we don't often talk about.
No, that's right. It's wrapped up in tag words like mental health. When you get down to what mental health actually means for an entrepreneur, there are a whole range of things. One, it's taking time off. 2, it's being able to make good decisions. How do you do that? Well, listening to good advice. You can't do that if you don't have a good plan or a pathway about how you're going to deliver your innovation to market. So the third reason that I formed Triple Innovation was actually to suggest to people that commercialization, whilst it has many facets to it, is still a process like everything else. And if you set down the process and you follow it, then you have a pathway. And the reason the pathway is important is because it tells you what you need to do. It means that you can identify distractions and eliminate them. And more importantly, it means you can identify those priority things that actually have to get done amongst the massive, more detailed activities that have to happen within MedTech. There is still a range of activities that actually have to be done, and they have to be done right in order to set the foundations for success. So it was those.
Yeah, I think that's really resonates with me, because you can get so caught up in the detail of what you're doing. It's hard to lift yourself above the immediate detail in order to work out what needs to be done, more broadly.
Exactly. So my role is essentially three things: helping entrepreneurs set the pathway in discussion with them, understanding them and who they are, and when to push and when not to push. And the third thing, which is really important, is once you've got your pathway, working out how you're going to fund it. So I also help entrepreneurs find the funding, work out their capital plans, and look forward 12 to 18, 24 months in order to get their product to market. What does it look like?
Sure. Now, tell me about this photograph.
This is...
Because I see it in all of your imagery.
This,
and why did you choose it?
Absolutely. This is the Miller Bridge in southwest France, and it's one of the longest span bridges in Europe. The most important thing, though, from my perspective, apart from its aesthetic beauty, which was one of the design briefs, was that it incorporates 8 patents, because this is a massive undertaking. These pylons are going up to 300 metres in the air across a fairly deep valley. But beyond the engineering, the architecture, and how people came together to actually do it, it's really emblematic of the type of proposition that I've been talking about, which is understanding how you get from A to B. And each of these pylons can really represent milestones along that journey. And milestones in the sense of,
I absolutely love it.
Yeah, milestones in the sense of reducing risk, but also milestones in the sense of being able to build enterprise value. Because every time you reduce risk on the road to commercialisation, you are building enterprise value, and you're making it easier for government to give you money and easier for you to attract money from investors. So this is a part of the pathway plan that I get really interested in, and breaking it down to discrete milestones that add value to the business and reduce risk for investors. Should we go on to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Now, I asked Jeremy to include this slide because it's a slide from the Genesis white paper. If you go to the Genesis electronic design website, you'll see, go to the medical bits, you'll see a white paper you can download there. And the reason I asked Jeremy to include it is that at Genesis, we always talk about a technical stream and a business stream. And the bottom half of this screen is all about the technical things that need to happen in the design and the development process, the engineering, the technology, so forth. But there's always a parallel stream that until recently Genesis did not get involved in. Genesis recently launched a new business called Genesis Medical Devices, which is now offering services in the top half of this this model. But I've always talked about the top half as being this is the business stream that needs to happen. And if you apologize for the quality here, it's a detailed screen that doesn't blow up well, but just to talk out loud for that, there's things like quality management system needs to be put in place. There's a whole lot of planning around the regulatory compliance process. There are some things about finance and funding, all the various personnel you need to have in place, the product realization process, setting up your supply chain, all that kind of thing. And the reason I was interested is that Jeremy, when I showed it to him, said, yes, that's really interesting. And they're all the things you need to do for a medical device, but they're not the things that I talk about because necessarily because these are the things that have, it's very much a product development process as opposed to a business strategy or a business planning process. So I was really interested in that perspective from Jeremy. Did you want to elaborate on that at all before you move on to your slides, Jeremy?
I think it's useful to keep this slide in mind as we're going through, because you won't see any words on this slide that I use in the presentation. or even in the way I talk about it. So these things are absolutely critical to getting your product to market, but they're not the things that are going to make your product a commercial success. At least some of them. You still need a plan, obviously.
Yeah.
But even what you do and how you do it will define how successful you are.
Yeah, I really love that, because that's what this community is all about. It's about, you know, taking one person's perspective or one organization's perspective and then adding onto it to building it. We're trying to build the body of knowledge here about what's needed to be successful overall. So, yeah, look, I just wanted to put that out there. If you want to get a clearer version of this, just go to the Genesis website and download that free white paper. Okay, yeah, you may as well start with your slides now, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you. Right, commercialisation is a planned process, as I've talked about previously, and it's important to understand that, because whilst people talk about pivoting and about the twists and the turns that they experience as they're going through commercialisation, and the deviations and the things that happen that you don't expect, it's still a planned process. And as I say in the military, it's less about the plan, which can change according to circumstance, but it's more about the planning, because it's the planning that gives you the confidence and the competence to know how to adjust if the plan that you have actually needs to adjust. So what do I mean by that? Well, innovation's the process of turning good ideas into value. So, and that's what we call commercialisation. The reason I've got, I point towards innovation and the fact that it's a process is because we all forget very easily that what we're about is turning good ideas into value. And as Thomas Edison once said, good fortune, in other words, luck, is what happens when planning meets opportunity. So that if you've got your plan and you've planned out how your business is going to work, then when the opportunity comes up, and it always does, you'll be in a very good position to take advantage of it, or to make a decision as to whether you want to take advantage of it or pursue something else. Now, the classic one is Edison with the incandescent light bulb. We all know that he didn't invent that. He stood on the backs of about 15 other patented inventions that had happened, but he looked for the one thing to make incandescent light bulbs work. And even when he had found that, he had to face another problem, which was, okay, I've done that, but how do I make a business out of it? It wasn't really until he could string light bulbs together and help get electricity generation moving that he started to make some real money. Okay, but that's all about constant planning, looking ahead and understanding what roadblocks there are and what you have to do in order to succeed.
Yeah, Jeremy, can I just ask a question there? What we find when we're doing medical device development, from an engineering perspective, there's always this desire to plan as much as possible at the start so that you know what you're doing, so that when you sort of hit the go button, you know, the whole, the work that you do is very streamlined, and, you know, you're not constantly changing your mind about the features you want and so forth. But what I just heard then is, and I do see this obviously, is that something comes up and you go, you know what, we need to pivot in this direction. How do you sort of reconcile that sort of need for rigor and you know, trying to plan everything out as much as you can, and not, you know, try and avoid variations to the agreement or variations to the requirements, because if they keep changing, it's really debilitating. But at the same time, you need to, you know, what are your thoughts about that?
It's a healthy balance. And the way I like to put it is, when you come to that decision-making point about whether an opportunity that has come up is something you need to pivot to versus what you're on at the moment, how do you make that decision? Is it just simply a gut feel? Because you can have gut feels on it on every decision point with every opportunity. Some will be right, some will be wrong. But more importantly, is it what is the information that you actually need to have at your fingertips to be able to make that decision in a logical way? And you can only do that if you understand the pathway that you're on well, and in a sense you understand the business that you're trying to create well. Because it's only when you understand that you also understand the value of the opportunity you're presented with. And the decision then is that new opportunity something that I actually need to go after? If yes, why? Or is it something that I can safely ignore and reject and continue on the original pathway? You can't know that unless you know what you're trying to pursue, where the end game theoretically is, and how you're going to get there. So that's being able to understand the resource decisions that you would have to make if you have to pivot, whether you can do it safely because it's just a small pivot, or whether it's a big pivot, what that means for the type of people you've hired, what that means for your timelines, what that means for the capital that you need to put against it. Is it more or is it less? When does that happen? Is the big capital curve in the next 3 months, or does it happen in the next 6 months? What does it do to a customer set that you were going after? There are a whole range of these factual points that you need to be able to pull together to be able to make a sound decision. And the reason I talk about sound decisions is because in a startup environment, most of the decisions that you make are important at some of these critical junctures, and you want to make sure that you're making the right decision as best as you can. And there's a series of right decisions that need to get made in order to succeed.
Yeah, would you make a comment about the Agile approach versus a Waterfall approach to development? I'm not sure if that falls in your expertise, but it's an engineering term that, yeah.
Well, both are very useful. So the Agile approach, I think about that in terms of getting particular parts of the project done. And the Waterfall approach is much more of a standardized sequential approach of this is the first milestone, here's the next milestone, and underneath that you can apply whatever Agile or other project management techniques that you wish to get the job done. But that only happens if your bridge is laid out across the valley, so you know roughly where you're heading. If you have to pivot, that's fine, but you want to make that decision with as many well-informed factual pieces of evidence as you can muster. Yeah. And that's about planning versus the plan. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about the process. It's a little bit glib what I've put in that black circle, but it's also always worthwhile reinforcing. There's no point to innovating unless you can make money and have a decent exit, because you invest a good part of your life for however long you're going to do this into this. It becomes not just your baby, but something that you do and you invest a lot into it. So unless you can find a way to make money and find a way to get an exit for yourself and any investors who invest money into your business, really just stop before you get started, because it's a rocky road. It takes time, and it takes a considerable amount of mental and psychological and emotional effort. So these next things I'm going to show you forms the basis of what every investor wants to know. Are you solving a real problem? What is your solution? Does it work? Who are your customers? How big is the market? Why will customers buy from you? Who are your competitors, substitutes? How will you make money? Who is on your team? And what is the exit point? Now, those eight points are incredibly important to making money out of your business, because if you get any one of them wrong, there's a problem, there's an interruption, and you won't optimize the financial opportunities that you're presented with in the market. And contrast this slide with the slide that Tim was talking about previously about the product development process. None of these points are on that slide, but these are the points that investors want to know about, and these are the points that are actually going to make you money, because they talk about customers, they talk about markets, and at the end of the day, the customer is the person who's buying a product from you, and they're the people who are going to generate revenue for you, and they're also the set of people, if you're manufacturing, who are going to generate profit and cash flow. And at the end of the day, it's all about cash flow. And if your business is successful and it goes international, then there's an opportunity to make a trade sale or to capitalize on the effort you've put in and make a capital gain out of your business, like most entrepreneurs want to do.
Jeremy, I think in terms of the MedTech space, what's in that black bubble on the left and the first point, are you solving a real problem? I see sort of two kinds of people who enter this, MedTech businesses. They're either sort of medical professionals, typically, say for example, a surgeon or something like that, who has identified, hey, if only I had a gadget or something like this, it would make this so much easier. So they think, yep, there's a real need here because I'm an expert in my field. And sometimes they're quite emotional about it. They say, look, people are really suffering. We need to do this. And money is almost a secondary consideration. They believe strongly that the thing is so important that, build it and they will come is it's sort of the philosophy that a lot of people get into this. And what I don't see a lot of is proper market research and analysis of, as you say, who are the customers and how many of them are there, and how many of them would actually pay a certain amount of money. And what's really important from a product development point of view, we get this again and again, is what is the unit cost that you can afford to sell this thing at? Some devices are disposable and they need to be sort of under $5-10. Others are, you can sell for tens of thousands of dollars, and there's a huge range there about, who's going to pay for it and how they're going to pay for it. And it's a really complex exercise that people just, they get caught up in the emotion of the need and don't necessarily ever transition to that objective. But is it going to be profitable?
That's right. That's why these points are being emphasized, and that's why it's so different from the product development process. And the human thing is to say, I see a need. That's fine. You may see a need, but if everybody else doesn't see the same need, or sees that a different technology can solve it, or that they can solve it without any technology at all, a different way, or indeed even think that the problem that you see isn't one that they want solved, or they think needs to be solved because it's not urgent for them. If any of those things happen, then you're sort of pushing your idea into a market that doesn't want it.
Yeah.
And the key thing you always have to balance is your perspective of what needs to be solved versus the market perspective of, well, it's a problem that is really big enough that I, as a customer, need to invest my money in.
And can I just ask to clarify between point 1 and point 4? Again, with that sort of build it and they'll come, if you solved a problem, surely people will buy it from you. But how is 4 different from that?
It's a good point, because you can be solving a real problem, but a customer may still prefer not to buy. There could be many reasons. One of the reasons may be there's a competitor with a similar technology with a better brand name, is bigger, uglier, and is more trusted. Another reason may be because there's a superior technology. Another reason may be because you may be solving a real problem, but it's not one that your customers see as a real problem.
Yeah, and I actually think that another aspect to that is that there's more than one problem being solved. Like what we've seen recently in two different projects is that you've developed a device that that meets a need, and there are competitors out there, and it's even slightly better. But because of the incumbents are entrenched in the marketplace, you know, it's like you have to provide a need to change from the incumbent technology to this new one, and it needs to be like orders of magnitude better in order to meet that need to change. If it was just based on the technology. But one of the things in these two projects we've seen is that not only does it do a better job, and it's not orders of magnitude, it's slightly better, but it's also disposable. And in a hospital setting, things that are disposable are very attractive because it means it doesn't have to be autoclaved, it doesn't have to go off to a different department. You avoid a whole lot of quality procedures, to make sure that it's sterile and ready for the next, use. And so it's a different need. It's not actually related to the necessarily the user needs in the product and development process, but it's a business need as well.
Yeah, look, the key point about this discussion, we'll need to move on, but the point that needs to be landed is that your idea is competing in a market. It's got competitors, there are potential substitutes by other ways to do it, or potentially even the problem doesn't need to be solved, but you're working with competitors, substitutes, customers, and any one of those actors in the market could easily say, no, I don't really like that, or it's not for me, or it's not solving the particular problem that I've got, maybe solving a different problem, but it's not solving the problem that I've got. Or I just may not like the aesthetics, or it doesn't work the way I want. So when you're operating in a market, you have to try and understand all those forces and find a way to shape your product so it's most attractive to customers, recognizing that they have different ways of solving the problem, and they're independent actors who may or may not like your solution to your perceived problem. And that's the point. You're operating in a market, and that's why business sense and business acumen become really important.
Yeah.
Let's
we've
move
got
on.
two questions from, well, we've actually got two questions from the audience. One in the chat and one in the Q&A. So I'll start with the chat one from Paulina. Hi all, she says, and I'll just read it out. You should be able to read this, Jeremy, but she asks, for the benefit of the audience, she asks, what would you suggest to be the best way to validate that the market wants the product you are developing? I found it difficult to understand the clinical decision-making process applied to medical devices having no background in medicine or care administration. If you are creating something significantly novel, what would be your strategy for engaging the customers from the early development stages?
Yeah, the strategy always is to go and talk to them. So that's part one. There are plenty of people who develop things but don't talk to the customers until later on, after they've got a working prototype or a pilot. Talking to customers doesn't cost money, it just costs time. So once you've got your idea, go out and start talking to people about whether they think that A, there's a problem, and B, that your potential solution is a very useful way to solve the problem. And don't just get a yes or no answer. Interrogate, ask why. Why do they think this? Why do they think that? What are the key issues that they think are important, either in the problem or in the solution features that you've articulated to them? And often you can just do this with a drawing. You don't have to develop a physical prototype. You can do it with a set of drawings and a set of listed features on a page, and just go talk to people. And that process will throw up a whole range of insights that can then inform you about the specifications that your solution would need to incorporate in order to be attractive to a set of customers. That's how you'd normally do it.
Yeah, it's a little bit to do with your point 7 about who's on the team as well, having
well, yeah,
advisors who have that clinical expertise.
That's right. But even you can just work with people who don't have clinical expertise, because they're the ones who will ask a different set of questions. They'll ask non-clinical questions. And often the choice of which medical device you go for, there's an assumption that all the clinical questions have been answered and the thing does its job, which is fine. But then there's a whole set of other criteria that come into decision making about whether they're going to take your product or someone else's product. So it's important to understand the holistic view of the customer and to understand how they would use the product. And once you've got a prototype, to follow them through about how they actually use the product and understand any barriers to using the product, what makes it easy, what makes it difficult, and to follow it through right from the first time they unpack the product to how they understand how to use it, the training, the use with patients, and then the post-clinical use. Is there any data or analysis that comes out of the product and how that's understood? And then what clinical remedies are applied at the back end of it. So it becomes an end-to-end exploration. And sometimes, I'd actually argue often, you need a combination of clinical people and non-clinical people to actually get the full perspective of what the patient or the customer actually sees.
Yeah. There's a question from Luke C regarding number 8. He's asking for examples of when the exit point, what the exit might look like, and when does it occur. So, for example, could you exit straight after getting regulatory approval, or even earlier after getting your first prototype in place, or is it maybe after you've been operating a year or two? And he also asks if there's do you need to disclose your exit plan, I think, to the team doing the scaling up?
Yes, to all of the above. The exit point is a challenge for most startups, and that's because they, at the time they're working through the product commercialization, that they're not also thinking about, okay, so who am I going to manufacture this, or am I going to license this to somebody? And when do I want to do that? And I guess the friction in this process is that everybody likes to think sequentially. So they think product first and then distribution last after they've got a validated product. What I'm suggesting here, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, is that this in fact is not linear. And whilst I've numbered these things 1 to 8, often what you need to do is to, when you're thinking about point 8, is to bring forward some of the thinking around how your product is going to get to market and who you need to be in touch with. Sometimes it's major distributors, and you start talking to them early about what they see in the market. Sometimes you have got 3 or 4 potential buyers down the track, and you might want to start talking to them at a certain point about what they're doing, how they would see that your product fits into their product portfolio, or how your product might be an add-on to what they're already doing. And that discussion, depending upon the type of device that you're developing, will actually help you inform your development path. It will help you understand what's the dynamics in the market. It will help you understand how to structure your product early on so that it can fit into somebody else's portfolio. And more importantly, it starts a set of relationships that ultimately will bear fruit one way or another. And it's bringing those earlier relationships into the product development process, which is really important, because just like customers, you'll gain insights from suppliers, you'll gain insights from downstream distributors, which will all impact how you market your product and indeed how you develop it. So I hope that answers the question. But the key point is you don't leave the exit point until the very last thing. There are a whole range of things you need to be considering up front.
Yeah, and thank you. And there's one, I know we want to move on, but I need to make this one key point for the benefit of the audience. It's more of a comment than a question, but around point number 6, how will you make money, is a very important consideration in the design and development phase, because if you think about the classic model of a printer, where they sell you the printer for a certain amount, which really just covers the distribution costs, but they end up making all of their money from selling you printer cartridges throughout the life of the printer. And this is increasingly the case for active medical devices, where you need to think about your model, your design and development model, from the point of view of, I mentioned the example before of disposables. Not all products can have a disposable stream where you can get that sort of printer cartridge, ink cartridge kind of model. But most active medical devices have software, and you can sell the software that goes with it, and people can use this device for the rest of its life using that software you sell with the product. Or you can have a license, a recurring license or an annual subscription fee, and provide value-added services via the software. So it's no need to belabor this point now, but it's a really critical point about all the various options you have for packaging the software together with the hardware.
Yep.
So, so let's move on.
We'll move on, but I'll just add to that very quickly. When we talk about the people that you need on the team, you've got the clinician, the inventor, if they're also a clinician, and then you've got the commercial people. So a lot of clinicians or doctors or whoever it is who's inventing thinks that the business side of it's easy. Well, you need to think of it in this way. You're an expert in your area, in your domain, and equally business is another domain where there are professionals, and those are the people you need to engage with to help drive these points 1 to 8. Because most clinicians also have a full-time job. Surgeons have a full-time job, but they're also creative. Some of them are, but they have the full-time job. Doing 1 to 8 is also a full-time job, and it also involves a range of expertise that is outside the domain of clinicians. So this idea that clinicians should also be business people is possibly not always the best way to do it. So I've got a number of clients where the surgeon says, look, I've come up with this idea, I've part developed it, and what he then did is he just hired a team and gave away equity, and the team has done 1 to 8. Now that particular business is pretty successful, and they're continuing to come up with new inventions, new ideas, because they've established the validity of 1 to 8. They're making money, they've established distribution networks, and the surgeon's really happy because he realizes he couldn't do it without the combination of skills and domain expertise that business, product, and clinicians bring to each other. And that's the key point to take away. And we go back to Edison. Edison was a fairly creative person himself, but what he realized in order to get his business up and running is he needed multi-skilled, multi-domain experts. And he went out and hired them, and he got them working for him. So the idea of the entrepreneur is doing everything is just a fiction. The way to success is you've got to build a team with multi-skilled domain expertise underneath. Let's move on. So we've talked about why problems Defining the right problem is really important because it does make the solution easy. But there's a whole range of additional points here. And we'll start with the Einstein comment that everybody knows. If I've given 1 hour to save the planet, I'd spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. So the solution is inherent in how we define the problem. And we've talked about this already. Is the observed problem the one that actually needs solving? And the way to understand that is to look at root cause analysis. This was popularized in the 5 whys that Toyota developed, and also Six Sigma. And really what it's trying to do is identify why the problem exists. So someone says, say on a Toyota production line, we need a different oil because the current oil doesn't work in the machine. And another person says, okay, let's start $1 million R&D program, develop a different oil. The management might say, well, hold on, why is that a problem? And the next person will say, oh, because the machine that can't do what we need it to do. So the next question is, well, is there another machine that does what we want it to do in order to avoid making or spending $1 million on developing a new oil product? And it might go on from there, because someone says, okay, why do we need a new machine? Is there a problem with our existing manufacturing process? That means we've got the wrong machine and the wrong oil. And that may start a whole different discussion about how to do the manufacturing process more efficiently, or to make it more simple to deliver the product that we want to deliver. The point of this is to use root cause analysis, because often the observed problem is a manifestation of a problem that exists up the supply chain somewhere. Okay, so every problem you see isn't necessarily the one you want solved. And once you identify the core problem, is it a problem worth solving? Who wants to solve it and why? And only once you've gone through those key checkpoints, a good discipline is to write down the problem statement. Here is the problem. This is why it's a problem. This is for whom it's a problem. And here's the benefit of solving for the problem. And in order to answer those questions, we need to go back and do some of the basic customer analysis that we were talking about before, and follow it through so you understand the end-to-end challenges that a potential customer has already with the problem you've identified, because that will then give you the set of features that you need to incorporate into your solution set in order to solve the problem that the customer actually has. And this is really important. There's a group in the US who specializes in just defining the problem, and they end up with a 1.5-page problem statement. So defining the right problem does make the solution easy, but defining the right problem is a process in itself. Once you've defined the problem, what is the solution? And the critical point here is how your solution is developed determines its commercial value. There's never one solution to an identified problem. But what you want to do is have quite divergent thinking. So what are all the available options to solve the problem, from the least technically smart to the most technically smart? And the key thing here is to explore all possible solutions, not just the one you think you might like, or the one you first happened on, or even your one. So is being prepared to abandon any solution in order to find a solution that best solves the problem. It's also important to ask a very simple question: why hasn't the problem been solved before? And that's a key thing, because once you get into that, you may find that there have been numerous attempts to solve the problem you identify. You'll understand what's been tried, what happened, and why. And all that's extremely useful, because you begin to understand the roadblocks that people have encountered, either from a clinical perspective or from a practical perspective, in trying to develop a solution that's useful in order to solve the particular problem you've identified.
Yeah, I have to really endorse that one, Jeremy, because one of the things that our CEO, Jess Sizer, is very fond of doing is that when we quite often get people ring us up or come in to visit and say, I've got there's a problem and we've got this great solution. And whilst we're busy talking about it, Jeff will get on the internet and do a bit of Googling, and within 5 minutes come up with a solution on the internet. And he goes, just like this one here, and there's this sort of stunned silence where they look at it and go, oh dear, somebody's already done it. Happens over and over again. Yeah,
it's a slightly different point to the one I was making, but it's nevertheless a point well made. Is once you think you've got your problem, then it's really incumbent on you to do the background literature research, or to do the Google searches, and to do a lot of talking to identify, well, has anybody else solved the problem? And if they have, where is it? Yeah. And is it on the market? Is it a commercial success? Because if it is, then maybe you can improve upon it significantly. But if you can't improve upon it, then find another problem.
I actually think if it is on the market and they're a commercial success, it's actually a fantastic indicator that it's a good market to get into. Where I get worried is where quite often we see products that have been developed previously. You can see the history of it, and you see patents and so forth that have been lodged, and they've failed. They've been a commercial failure, and it's very difficult to find out why they were failed, because people obviously don't want to talk about it, or it isn't publicly available. And if that's the case, then you've got to be really worried that, well, if they fail, what makes me think I can succeed? Maybe there's some fundamental that, you're not seeing some fundamental issue just hasn't entered into your equations. Yeah. Anyway, don't let me delay you any further.
No, the overarching point is to reach out into the market and try and understand what's gone before, whether there's something already in the market, whether there's space for your product in the market. To do this basic thinking time, it doesn't cost you any money. It just costs you time on your computer when you've got to spare a couple of hours for a couple of weeks, and just really understand. You'll gain incredible insight from it. The last point was co-designing and prototyping concepts and solutions with potential users. The italicized and the blue font, test, observe, learn, improve. This is about the iteration. This is about the genuine innovation that happens. And I put your ideas in inverted commas, because it's less about your idea and it's more about a solution that users want. And that's the difference between pushing your own barrow and trying to develop a business that's going to make money. You always have to divorce your mindset and, in a sense, who you are from the reality that you're trying to create a business, and the business is trying to create money. So you'll do whatever you can to make that business create money, solving the problem. And you should be fairly agnostic in the early stages about what solution that actually is, whether it's your solution or a hybrid solution where the whole range of other people have contributed to it, or indeed a different solution. And this is important. Prototyping is the conversation you and users have with your ideas, and just expect your ideas to be fundamentally different at the end from what you originally hypothesized, and that's all okay. That's just an example of the conversation working. Okay, who are your customers? It's really important to define your target market because it's one of the biggest decisions that you'll make. Is the market growing? What are the key trends driving growth? So in your clinical area, for example, if you're looking at hearts, just for example, you know, who's doing work in your area? What are the key trends driving research in the area that you're looking at, as defined by the problem? And how big is this market? So you may have a real problem, but if it's a really small market that you can't make any bigger, then the chances are that your business opportunity is quite small, and that then contextualize any decisions that you want to make about how much time you want to spend doing this, because the problem might be real, but it's just not a big problem or a big enough market. And the last point is important. We've talked about that before. What can you learn about your market, how it's structured and how it behaves? And what I mean by how it's structured and how it behaves, if there are 4 big global distributors in your market and they own 80% of the market, then your chance of commercializing something without support from them, unless you've got something truly disruptive, is more limited, which means you have to talk to them and you have to understand how they compete with each other, what their product portfolio is, and how your ideas or your prototype, your patented idea fits into their product portfolio. That's really important.
Jeremy, it's an important. I just want to, in terms of MedTech, mention another dynamic in both the size of the market and how it behaves, and that is government. Because when you talk about MedTech market, we're talking about hospitals, it's not necessarily a pure commercial, capitalistic, demand-driven market. Sometimes government will make decisions that are not commercial, and I'll give you an example. One of the clients that Genesis has is Neuromersive, which is a device for supporting customers with after brain strokes with rehabilitating hand movement and so forth. And initially when I sort of saw that, I thought, how many people out there have this condition, and is it a big enough market? I asked that exact same question, because it turns out that it's a reasonable market, but it's not that big. But if the government says this is a social issue and we have a duty of care to support that, then you'll get grants, you'll get money, and gets onto the reimbursement scheme of governments around the world. So it's a very complex dynamic when it comes to medical devices. It goes beyond the sort of the standard textbook sort of demand-driven equations, I guess.
Yeah, it's just another complexity, but recognizing that complexity, you need to then factor it into your thinking, so that if you want to put something into the New South Wales Health Network, then you need to engage ultimately with New South Wales Health. You obviously need to get TGA approval, but engaging with New South Wales Health is important, and there are people you can find to do that, and to ask questions, validate the problem, validate the health economics around the problem, and then get their involvement to help validate the solution. There's a whole range of things, but it's understanding who your market, how it's structured, how it behaves, and then reaching out to various stakeholders who can help you or pull you along the process. Again, the quote from Seth Godin is, everybody is not your customer. There are some people who think that everybody will buy this. Well, that's not always true. It's important to recognise that your customer set is not homogenous, and different people will buy your product for different reasons. And if that's the case, then you need to market it to those people for those particular reasons, not just talk about the features of the product. And we'll get onto that in a minute. Okay, why will customers buy from you? So if you look in the the black circle, there are 3 smaller white circles. So you've got your solution. You understand what the customer wants, and there's an intersection between what your solution delivers and what the customer wants, and then there's competing solutions. And there are always competing solutions, even if that competing solution is what we call non-consumption. So people solving for the problem without needing your solution in a different way, or people just deciding that the problem that you see is not something that actually needs to be solved. And the sweet spot, the value proposition for your solution, is in the middle of all those 3. Okay, so this is important from MedTech as well, because the end user is not always the customer. So if you're looking in a medical context, sometimes it's the hospital who's buying a device, and it just happens that you've developed a very low cost device, and all the other devices that solve the problem are significantly high capital cost. Sometimes it's the surgeons who tell the hospital that they want the product because of its clinical efficacy. Sometimes it's the nurses who want the product because it actually delivers benefits to them that they can't get anywhere else. And sometimes this is really good for the patients. So point of care stuff is really good for patients. Nothing to do with hospitals, but again, the economic buyer may be different from the actual beneficiary of the clinical use. Then we've got to talk about what's the value proposition for the economic buyer, who may not be the user, and what's the benefit statement for the user as well. So we can see when you've got multiple stakeholders, there may be multiple pitches that you need to do to the economic buyer, the person who's going to be using the device, and also the patient. And it's a holistic view of that value proposition that gets brought together, that gives the benefit statement to each of the stakeholders, each of whom are looking for a benefit statement in your value proposition that actually speaks to their particular need. So this is an important point. Every feature in your solution should have a corresponding benefit to the customer user. If you look at Microsoft, 80% of the features that Microsoft has available aren't used by the standard user. And when we're talking about medical devices, it's really important to keep them low cost, but also to make sure that the features that you're offering are only those features that are actually going to be used. Okay, and each feature that you have in your product needs to be speaking to a particular benefit that you're delivering, either to the economic buyer, the clinical user, and or the patient, because that means you've got something which is uniquely designed to solve the problem and is efficient to use, of high benefit to the user, and is economically viable for the hospital to go out and buy.
Jeremy, how does that relate to the whole minimal viable product sort of concept? And you know, not all features are going to have the same value. You know, so there'll be, yeah, like where do you stop? You got your core benefits, and then there's going to be the bells and whistles, which can really make a project, you know, drag out and, you know, say, oh, but wait more though, just sort of this extra thing, can we add that in? And it gets really messy. How do you rationalize, you know, the cutoff point where you say, look, you know, you have to cut off you know, there must be a cutoff point where the benefit of a feature becomes of a diminishing value.
Yes. There are a couple of tools that people use. One is forced ranking. So they get all the features of their product in a list, and they get the various stakeholders to rank the importance of the benefit statement that attaches to each feature for them. Okay, and at the end of it, you'll have a force ranking, and what you then do is say, okay, here's the top 4 features. How much does it cost to put those into our device? The next 3 or 4 may be ranked as nice to haves if you can do it, and then the last couple might be okay. Well, it's something that may well be the bells and whistles we can do in 2 years. But the point about it is the force ranking gives you the prioritization of the features and the benefits that you need to be marketing against. It will then also allow you to go out and cost each of these features in terms of how much additional complexity it adds to the device, how much it costs, and the impact on timeline. Okay, and once you get to the end of all that analysis, you've got a pretty good understanding of what your minimum viable product should actually look like, what's essential to have in your product in order to attract the customer set that you're looking for and to get them to buy. You can make then make decisions about the next set of value points, some of which you may want to include because they don't cost a lot, but they provide significant additional value and further differentiation from any competition out in the marketplace. So it's also a process of analysis. And what we've just talked about goes into making what makes your value proposition compelling. So a must-have rather than something that people can do without. Again, and this whole process is as much about defining the problem as it is about defining the features of the solution and the associated benefit statements that are going to compel customers to want to buy your product versus spend their money doing something else, i.e. not solving the problem, or versus spending the money buying an alternative solution. So this page goes back to that initial question, what's the difference between defining the problem and getting customers to buy? They're linked, but they're also different. And we just need to always remember the value proposition is the primary reason why a customer should buy from you, and not from somewhere else, not from someone else or somewhere else. Okay, who are your competitors? Substitutes. Competitor intelligence gives a market view of comparative advantages and disadvantages. So we began to talk about this before. Understanding your market, who's in it, and understanding the competing solutions is a source of information that then helps you to understand the features that you need to have in your product. So because the market has a certain set of core features in their product, and it also will then help you understand how you're going to differentiate your product from somebody else's product. And that may be making those core features that everybody has in their product better, smarter, more efficient. So competitor intelligence comes from a couple of different sources: direct competitors, market share analysis, growth, trends, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So if you're looking at competing devices, go use them or talk to clinicians who use them and find out what works for them and what doesn't. Look at potential competitors, because there are plenty of people who are doing research in the same area around the world. There are plenty of companies who have the capabilities to get into this market, who may be working on something. And it's as much going beyond the direct competitors to look at the broader market, to understand more about your solution, and more about the features of the solution, and more about the benefits the solution is going to deliver. This is all about trying to differentiate yourself from competing products. And it's all about making a compelling value proposition that customers will be attracted to and therefore make them to buy. Substitutes, what workaround solutions exist? Sometimes the workaround solution is very efficient and it's effective, high efficacy, and people don't want to depart from that. That's just a change management solution, but it's also recognizing that these workaround solutions are as real and tangible as direct competitors. We're talking about the army of non-consumers, people who decide that the problem you see is not actually worth solving. And this point's important. Marketing without market research is like driving with your eyes closed. And the arrowhead of all this is really your value proposition, and that will change over time, and it will change with investigation, it will change with insight. So it's always good when you're first developing your solution just to map out what you think your features are and what the corresponding benefit statement is for the set of stakeholders you've identified who are going to be important buyers of your product. And then it's continuing to mold that, add to it, imbue it with greater insight from your market research. How will you make money? Okay, so the quality of your financial model shows how much you understand your business. Absolutely. What does that mean? It means that you need to work with an expert, or if you've got good Excel skills, you need to work through a P&L. And what's the profit and loss? That's revenue. How many unit sales are you going to make? What are you going to sell it for? That will give you your revenue. Then what does it cost you? What is it going to cost you to make? What other expenses are you going to have to incur? Who is your management team? And at the bottom of all that, you get a profit statement and then a cash flow statement. And the reason this is important, it goes back to something Tim said before. If you've identified how big your market is, and you've identified the price point that you can safely sell into the market to get the volume of unit sales that you want, you can then work backwards from there to say, okay, if my device needs to sell for $100, then I need to get it manufactured for $35. And that poses a question: can you get it manufactured for $35? Or if you need to, how do you actually do it? These questions become really important because it's broadening your understanding of how the business is going to operate. And if you're going to go out and attract investor funding, the investors are definitely going to want to understand what your unit cost margin is going to be. So for every unit you're selling to the marketplace, how much you're going to make? Because then it's a simple question of, the next question would be, how many unit sales are you going to make over what period of time? Because that will then show the profit, and that will then give investors a very back of the envelope way to calculate what return they're going to get if they invest money with you. And even if you don't go for investors, it's really important for you to understand that, because this is how you're going to invest your time and your money to make some money at the back end.
And Jeremy, sorry, I'm very interested to understand, like in the design and development world. So very typically, you know, if you've got the entrepreneur or the technology person, they'll come along with part of the solution, but they typically hire a whole lot of service providers, industrial designers, electronics designers, packaging designers, clinical trials operators, you know, so on and so forth. And you know, there's a unit price, which is, you know, what are the component parts, the bill of materials, how much does it cost to test it, assemble it, and then test it, and then manufacture it, assemble it, and test it, and then package it. So there's a sort of a, you know, and then distribute it. You know, there's a landed unit cost associated, but there's also how much money does it cost to design it? So you've got, you know, it may be in the order of $2 million to develop a design and development fees to design and develop and go through the regulatory process to get a device designed, and that cost needs to be amortized across you know, this planning process. So when we come to people, you know, we often talk about the things that they're always interested in is how much it's going to cost to develop this thing, and what will the unit cost be? Is the two sort of key questions that we have. But they quite often, that's the first question they're asking us, whereas it should be the last question. You know, after they've done all of this, how much can I afford to spend on it? And then if the cost to develop it exceeds that, then the business case doesn't stack up. But I don't see a lot of that happening. And yeah, I'd be interested in your comments on that.
The challenge with MedTech or anything in health, pharmaceutical, is that the regulatory, the timelines are attenuated and regulatory approvals attenuated, and both of them cost a lot of money. So in order to understand, and this is not how people do it, but in order to understand whether you can stomach the upfront capital cost to develop your product and get it to a point where you can actually do pre-sales, you also need to understand as much as you can what that forecast financial model looks like. And the reason you need to do that is because if you haven't got resources at your disposal to pay for all that pre-work, and let's face it, that's where the biggest capital risk is, and that's where the biggest amount of money has got to be spent in development and design for manufacturing and all the rest of it. If you haven't got those resources, then you need to go and find external money. You can do that through government grants if you're lucky to get one of those. Most commonly, you do it through accessing funds from high net worth individuals or from venture capitalists. And the challenge with doing that is that every investor and every venture capitalist is investing their money to get a return. And if you can't show them a financial model and you can't show them a clear pathway, in the sense of project managed pathway, about the development path and what it's going to cost to get there, then people are going to be very reluctant to invest their money in your venture. And the exception to that is if you've developed a solution to a nagging problem that everybody knows and sees, then some investors will take the risk. So for example, if you developed a very, very accurate test that replaces the PSA test for very early detection of aggressive prostate cancer, which affects men, or breast cancer, which affects women, or some other cancer that everybody knows about, everybody's been touched by, in those sort of cases, then sure, you can attract a bucket of money. But there are a whole range of circumstances outside of that, excuse me, where you need to rely on just good old-fashioned Excel spreadsheet work to create a financial model that you can share with an investor and talk to them about, and more importantly, identify where the key risks are and where capital needs to be put against those key risks, how much and when. Okay, and also how big is the market? How will an investor get a return on their capital? Because once they put it into your business, as equity, for example, that capital is stuck there until such time as you and the investor can work out a way to sell the business or otherwise monetize the value of the business through licensing or something else. And that's a reluctant point. That's a reluctance point where investors will say, I don't understand what you're doing, or I understand what you're trying to do, but there's no financial model to validate it, and there's no exit point. So that is a big risk for me versus what else I can do with my money. Put it in a bank, lend it, or invest in other opportunities. So again, every time you think about this, you need to think about the fact that you're operating in a market and that the people who are potential buyers of your product or potential developers or potential investors always have alternative uses for their money. That's the key thing. And we talked about creating a revenue model, and we talked about creating a cost model. And the reason you create your financial model is because in order to identify the number of units you're going to sell, you have to make certain assumptions. In order to identify the price, you have to make certain assumptions. And what you do after you've got your draft financial model is you keep on refining it, just like your value proposition. And you keep on investigating the validity of your assumptions. If the assumptions change, the numbers change, which is all fine. This is a voyage of exploration, but it's a voyage of exploration that has to be started, like your value proposition, from the early days. And you'll build it up, and at the end point, you'll end with quite a sophisticated financial model, but importantly, a financial model that stacks up in terms of assumptions that can be objectively validated by an investor or someone you turn to gain support. And that may be future employees. They'll want to know whether your business is going to be viable as well, because they have alternative employment opportunities, just like investors. Who's on your team? Investors might love this solution, but they're investing in you to commercialize it. So what they want to know is that you have got the capability and skills to understand your business. They want to know that you've got the capability and the skills to explain the financial ins and outs of your business through your financial model. So in MedTech, they expect to have a high quality scientific team and scientific advisory team. They like to understand what skills there are and who's actually doing what. And they also like to have a team of commercial managers who've had successful startup or commercialization experience. If you're talking MedTech, they prefer to have that in MedTech. They like to see a board or a set of experienced advisors. So who's on the board? What domain experience do they have? How involved are they? Can they open the doors for you when needed? That's important, because that gives investors a sense of confidence, and it gives potential employees a sense of confidence when they join you. What are the decision-making governance processes? And we talked about how important it is in a startup environment to make as many right decisions as you can. Well, how you do that's important to manage decision-making risk. And this next point, do you understand the risks in the development pathway well enough to change or tackle, pivot when needed, or indeed to just progressively solve each of the issues? The more you can articulate that and demonstrate domain competence in the area you're solving for, the more confidence it gives to investors, because they are investing in you. And things will go wrong. That's inevitable. So it's not about the plan, it's about the planning. And it's how we respond to each of these body blows when they happen that matters. It's just like anything else. Ash Barty in sport. If you lose a set in tennis, how do you respond? If you lose a crunch game in tennis, how do you respond? So, and where's the exit? We've talked about this. Investors might love you, but they also need to find a pathway to exit. That really means a pathway to get their money back. So when? Is it 20 years? Because investors aren't going to like that. Most people like to get out in 5 to 7 years. And investors want to know, well, what's the value of your business going to be worth in 5 to 7 years? Because they need to calculate the return they're going to get on the money. It's just like lending it out. What return am I going to get? And it's important if it's a 5 to 7 year term, because once you know that, then you can sort of work backwards from there and say, okay, the first year's sales need to be this, second year's sales need to be this, third year's sales need to be this, fourth year's sales need to be this, and at the end of the 5th year, I'm going to exit. And I will exit knowing that in year 1, I did what I needed to do to create the year 5 enterprise value that's going to give me X million dollars repay investors with an adequate return, and I can walk away with Y million dollars. Are you going to do it through a trade sale, IPO, or annuity revenue stream? They're different business models. Yeah. And how will investors get rewarded? They're another stakeholder that are as important as your customer. Okay, so summing up, the product development process is normally seen as linear and sequential. Defining the problem, getting the concept, doing some fundraising, doing market research, prototype, financial model pilot, business model, and launch. You know, that's the picture we have for triple innovation. But in fact, the discussion today has demonstrated that this is more dynamic. And this is where the balance between iteration and planning comes into play. And at the center of it is, are you solving a real problem? What is the solution? Does it work? Because there's an interplay between those two that we've demonstrated. Who's on your team? That's important, because the solution you're developing needs to be aligned to the capability and skills that you have, the expertise that you have. Who are your customers? They affect the solution, because the solution delivers features which need to be turned into benefit points for customers. So you need to have the right features to get the right benefits, because you're solving, this is part of your problem statement. Why will customers buy? That's important because it's part of the value proposition. The value proposition should be inherent in how you're solving the problem, and therefore should be inherent in how you're defining the problem at the start. Who are your competitors? How will you make money? You know, you may have a real problem that needs solving, but if you can't make money, then you're never going to get a product to market in enough scale that's going to shift the dial about how the problem is solved for the ultimate patients or the clinicians. And what is the exit point? That's obviously connected to how you make money, but it's also connected to who you have on your team at certain points, recognizing that the composition of your team will change as your business develops. Tim. Yeah, question from Luke. Yeah, absolutely. Getting your money back is a normal timeline for investors in most sectors. With MedTech, that may take a little longer because the product development timeline is more attenuated. So that may take 10 years. But it's also a question of if you're going to seek equity, then how do you minimize the amount of equity that you need up front by leveraging government grants or other support that you can get to try and reduce the call on capital and how much you actually need from your investors. So it does take longer, and I guess the 5 to 7 years estimate is from the time that you actually start to get going. So there's commonly, you know, between 5 and 8 years to get an idea that you have in the clinical environment through to TGA approval. That can be faster or slow depending upon what you're looking at.
Yeah. Sorry, Jeremy, I had myself on mute earlier. Look, if there are any other questions, send them in right now, because we have gone well over time, and I'll so I won't invite any questions. Oh, Luke's still asking some. Of these extra 8 milestone steps you mentioned, is there anything that is extra important or something to be extra careful about for a MedTech startup?
If you had to pick one, it would be just get the value proposition right, because that implies everything else. And just remembering that the value proposition, or the compelling value proposition, is what your customers are going to buy. And at the end of the day, it's the customers, whether they will buy and how much they'll pay for it, because you're running a business. Business is driven by revenue, and revenue is driven by number of customers that you have.